Early session today. This is actually our second morning event on the national security strategy. The week before the NSS was released, the New America Foundation had the great pleasure of hosting an off-the-record event with Dennis McDonough and Ben Rhodes at the Metropolitan Club. And Bruce, if you all promise to keep thinking strategically, we promise to keep talking about it over coffee and pastries. Welcome to the Decoding the National Security Strategy event, jointly sponsored between the New America Foundation and our good friends at the National Security Network. My name is Patrick Doherty. I am the director of the Smart Strategy Initiative here at the New America Foundation. We're one of the newest initiatives here, and our mission is to promote a fresh discourse about American grand strategy. Along the way, we also hope to develop some innovative thinking about how U.S. grand strategy can address some of the biggest challenges facing our nation in the 21st century. I have to thank Bruce and the Obama administration in general for making our job a whole lot easier with the publication of this new national security strategy. For many people, this national security strategy won them over simply by announcing that the White House was finally viewing the world as it is, not as the world as the project for a new American century sees it. But for me, I think historians will remember this national security strategy as the moment some 20 years after the end of the Cold War, when Washington started to remember that the American way of strategy is about more than how we conduct the nation's affairs overseas. What we do within our own borders sets the parameters for what we need to do overseas and what we can do overseas. President Obama's strategy explicitly recognizes that fundamental relationship, opening the doors to some important national conversations. Of course, you'll notice that I said that I need to thank Bruce for making our job easier, not for making our work irrelevant. The Obama administration, in many ways, remains in triage mode, and the issues this national security team has to deal with on any given day or week tend to crowd out their ability to work on the big issues they came in to solve. Indeed, the global financial crisis, Afghanistan, Iraq, North Korea, Iran, Yemen, Israel, Palestine, Haiti, Honduras, even a Marine air station in Okinawa are sapping much of the bandwidth that ought to be devoted to the development and execution of a 21st century successor to containment. Of course, there have been some notable successes. The G20 has become the vehicle for high-level consultation on the global economy. The START treaty with Russia has been signed. Proximity talks between the Israelis and Palestinians have tentatively commenced. Troops are leaving Iraq. Even Cuba is talking officially with the administration. Clearly, though, this is not enough. My boss here at the New America Foundation, Steve Clements, who regrets that he's unable to join us today. Steve is fond of saying that on a recent trip to Beijing, he met the director of China's policy planning unit. As they sat down to talk, Steve opened the exchange with an off-the-cuff question, "So what is keeping you busy these days?" To which the Chinese diplomat replied, "Keeping you folks distracted by small Middle Eastern conflicts." So the question that confronts us today here is just that. Are we, as Dan Dresner likes to ask, avoiding the trivia? The articulation of a national security strategy ought to reflect some sense of whether an administration is distracted or is thinking strategically and is correlating our national means to our most important ends. Are the stimulus, healthcare, and financial reform packages enough to revive domestic prosperity and reduce our debt? Are strategic dialogues enough to counter the mercantile strategies of China and the migration of more than 1 billion people into the world cities by 2030? Will we shift to a sustainable global economy before the ecosystem is depleted beyond repair? Is our national security architecture capable of delivering the capabilities we need at the time and place we need them without destroying our budget or our credibility? These are the questions of strategy. This is what gets me up on a podium so early in the morning. To present the national security strategy and answer some of our questions, we are honored to be joined by Bruce Gentleson, professor of political science at Duke University and a part-time senior advisor to the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department. We are happy to relay that while Bruce did have a hand in preparing the national security strategy, today he will be speaking in his private capacity, personal capacity, as a university professor. Bruce has had an extraordinary career in and out of government, working as a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator and then later presidential candidate Al Gore, working on the policy planning staff during the Clinton administration, and holding posts at USIP, IIS, Oxford, Stanford, and UC Davis. His forthcoming book is The End of Arrogance, America in the Global Competition of Ideas, co-authored with Stephen Weber. Responding to Bruce's remarks from different perspectives, we're extraordinarily pleased to be joined by James Loker and Michael Lind. Jim, most of you will know, is actually part of the reason why we're even talking about national security strategy at all, because he was the chair of the staff panel on the Senate Armed Services Committee that put together Goldwater Nichols. He's now the executive director of the Project on National Security Reform, a remarkable effort designed to provide the foundation for what ought to be nothing short of a new National Security Act for the 21st century. If you have not checked out the report, please do. I strongly recommend option number 2. Before leading PNSR, Jim served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Our own Michael Lind is one of the 3 founders of the New America Foundation and our first fellow. Along with former New America President Ted Halstead, Mike was the author of the book, The Radical Center, The Future of American Politics, the book that shaped the trajectory of New America. But for this morning, the more relevant book of Michael's is The American Way of Strategy, one of the few critical examinations of post-Cold War American grand strategy out there, and prescient in its identification of the contradictions that would lead to both the Great Recession and our military overstretch in Southwest Asia. But first, I will turn the podium over to our partner in today's event and my regular partner in crime, Heather Hurlburt. Heather is Executive Director of the National Security Network, founded by Rand Beers, and now chaired by Major General Paul Eaton and Les Gelb. Heather has the rare calling of being able to make foreign policy make sense to the American people, a job she's done as a speechwriter to President Clinton, Secretaries Albright and Christopher, as well as then Senator Hillary Clinton. Heather will take a few minutes to set the stage, and then we'll get right to Bruce. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks so much for using New America's wonderful facilities to host this event this morning. National Security Network was very interested in promoting and having this conversation take place because we view our role in Washington as making sure that the best long-term, brilliant, thoughtful, deep strategy ideas make sense in the short-term political context that so many of us are forced to contend with in our daily work lives, and more important, that our decision makers and opinion shapers are consumed by. So my role this morning is to put the strategy and the debate over strategy back into the short-term political context, for which I feel I should apologize to the rest of our panelists, but that's the world we live in out there. And so to start with, I want to say that one of the, I think, disappointments for Jim and everyone who was involved in the Goldwater Nichols process that led to the mandate for a national security strategy is that, in fact, and perhaps this was always inevitable, the strategies do come out into this extremely political and politicized context. And where I think Patrick ran through a number of the substantive policy challenges that are keeping our friends in the White House pinned down on a day-to-day basis, I think you could equally say that it's the political climate we face which is really pernicious to any kind of development and debate of what folks on the panel would recognize as grand strategy. And that in that kind of political environment, this administration, like almost every administration that has submitted a national security strategy, with the exception of the first George W. Bush strategy, chose to try to do something rather different. And I want to use my 5 minutes to suggest that this strategy fills a couple of purposes, and then to think about what that means. And first is to say that the national security strategy is a signaling device. That it is a device to signal your foes, your partners abroad, your friends at home, and most importantly, the people who work for you in the national security bureaucracy, what it is you intend to do. And in that sense, it was interesting when you asked folks at the White House at the other meeting that Patrick referenced, and at some other meetings that were held with senior White House staff to discuss the strategy, what it is that they thought they were doing with it. You got back comments like, well, this ties a thread through everything we've been doing. And I've started in my own mind to think about this as national security strategy as review essay. So if, in fact, you wanted to get a good sense of everything the administration has done on national security for the past 18 months, plus give him points for consistency, what was said on the campaign, without going back and reading 2, 3, 4 years of speeches. If you sit down and read cover to cover the national security strategy, you'll actually get a pretty good sense. And in many cases, it's exactly the same phraseology that the president has been using since he first popped onto the national scene. So, as I say, the national security strategy as review essay. And why is that useful? It's useful to signal to your friends and foes overseas, frankly, as well as your friends and foes at home, that you really mean what you say. You keep saying, for example, that nonproliferation policy is important. Then you list it first in your security challenges at the front of the document. That communicates that you mean what you say. Now, if you're someone who likes to read Politburo tea leaves, you then go on and notice that in the body of the document, it actually doesn't come first. It comes second behind terrorism. Then you could have some sort of fun Kremlinology questions with that. It also signals, it gives you another chance to signal to the media and to folks who maybe still, because they're distracted by 20 other sets of political and substantive issues, as Patrick mentioned, that you really mean what you say, that you really mean what you say about multilateralism, that you really mean what you say about engagement, that no, you haven't backed down from that, that you're really serious about putting the economic issues at the heart of foreign policy. And in our 24/7 drip, 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 constant barrage media culture, you simply can't anymore miss an opportunity to remake all of your main points again. So it becomes, frankly, impossible to put out a magisterial document that says only 2 or 3 things when you have 5 or 10 points that you feel that you really have to keep hammering home all the time. So I would say that's point 2. Now, the other interesting thing about this signaling function is that you're trying to signal both change and continuity at the same time. That you're trying to signal in some of the areas that Patrick mentioned, plus some others that we'll, I think, get into more in the discussion: climate change, the role of the military, the relative importance of terrorism, and how you talk about terrorism and who it is that you're fighting against. The administration has made some fairly radical departures from the policies of its predecessors. It has also, as Patrick mentioned, noticed that the Cold War is over and has made some steps toward reorienting U.S. foreign policy to reflect that. So some fairly significant changes. But you've also had a political calculation that at the moment where there are a number of other key priorities, domestic going on, and frankly, a political battle over every piece of the national security agenda, that it's not particularly useful to continue to stress the change theme in national security. And I think there's real and legitimate concern about how much the American public really wants a change theme in national security. So at the same time, you have, and this was really captured for me by James Fallow's comment on the president's West Point speech, that this was a speech that President Eisenhower would have been very comfortable with. So you have throughout an attempt to stress continuity, an attempt to stress a return to sort of traditional American ways of strategy, American ways of leadership. And of course, if you're trying to explain to a 20-second soundbite culture that you're doing both change and continuity, the general response to that is going to be sort of a throwing up of hands. And you combine this with, you also use your national security strategy to signal the priority that you're attaching to national security. And this is where the first W strategy is really an outlier, and this one goes much more back to a pattern of normalcy, at least post-Cold War, and during the Cold War as well, although Jim may contradict me on this. Many people, actually, I had a conversation with a retired journalist last night, mentioned that I was going to be doing this panel this morning, and he said, "Oh, do we have a national security strategy?" And what you may recall that there were, I think, 3 different BP events on the day that this was rolled out. There were also a number of launch events and senior administration officials flying all over town giving speeches, but it completely sank beneath the waves of oil. So as opposed to the early Bush II environment, where you had both an administration that had decided that national security was its #1 priority post 9/11, and a public and media elite that was very ready for that, that's not the situation now. There was a deliberate decision to try to bring this to the attention of policy wonks like everybody in this room. and bring all of us on board without, frankly, having the kind of big national debate that the notion of a grand strategy imagines. So in sum, by choosing to hold this document a long time, release it in a low-key way, and promote it as a return to core patterns of American leadership, altered for a new century and a new global reality, the administration has done almost the opposite of the Bush '02 strategy. It's made some significant changes and opted not to hype or promote them, and not to frankly push the grand strategy buttons even where perhaps it could have. Deliberately opted not to engage in the kind of grand strategy debate that several members of this panel have done so much to encourage and so passionately want to see. And I'll close on that by telling an anecdote that I was telling Jim before this panel started, that I was in a briefing at the White House the night before the strategy was released, and someone actually asked a senior White House official, well, what about those PNSR reforms that Jim Locher has been so passionate about? Why aren't those in here? And the White House official said, well, you know, we think that those are good ideas, but we think there's a lack of consensus on even more fundamental ideas, and that we have to fix that first. So what this document to me represents is an effort to put forward a set of principles that could in future condition the kinds of grand strategy debates that folks on this panel have been instrumental in leading outside of government. And whether that is a wise approach, or whether that's approach that will be overwhelmed by events, remains to be seen, and maybe that's one of the topics our panel can take up. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce to tell us what really happened.
Thanks very much to Heather and National Security Network and Patrick and New America for putting this event together. It's called Decoding National Security Strategy. I confess I did not bring my decoder ring, but I will try to provide some sort of analysis and insight. And as Patrick said, you know, I serve on a consulting basis, actually working with my longtime friend and colleague, Anne Marie Slaughter, who's the head of policy planning, on a very part-time consulting basis. But I had some involvement in this national security strategy, but I'm really speaking not as an official spokesman, but in my own private capacity. I think the timing for this event is very good. The initial sort of wave of discussion, national security goes out, people comment in the media and the blogs, et cetera, has kind of run its course. And I think it's kind of a second wave now of not taking a fresh look at it, but kind of taking it the next step. And that's sort of the context of my remarks. And in the interest of being brief, conscious of the time and wanting to hear from my colleagues on the panel, I'm not going to cover all aspects. What I'd like to do is talk about what I think some of the strengths are, and what I think what some of the limitations are. And then we'll have colleagues' assessments, discussions, and plenty of time to respond to particular questions and comments. It is good to start, and I think what Heather said is really very helpful about what purposes is a national security strategy generally supposed to serve. Not just this one, but its predecessors and the like. And I think to just kind of work with what she said, there are really two aspects. I mean, the strict definition of a strategy in the sense of linking objectives to resources, having plans of action, organizational structure and reform, doesn't really fit what national security strategies do. They really are more, the notion of signaling is a very good one, they're really more frameworks that I think are supposed to at least try to do three things. Lay out a worldview. What is the context? What's the strategic context this administration that's making foreign policy sees the U.S. acting in? What's the landscape? Secondly, what are the key objectives? And thirdly, sort of a general approach in terms of policy priorities and the like. There is an argument that should be closer to a strategy than a framework. Some of that will come through in what I see as sort of the strengths and limitations. But I think that's really what, and I think there's a lot of value to it being this kind of framework. Some have even argued we should have shorter national security strategies, 15 to 25 pages, a broad framework. So it could kind of go in a lot of different directions. The second point, I think, is very much pertains to an administration's first national security strategy, and that is setting out the mix of change and continuity. Campaigns, by definition, are about differentiation. That's what campaigns are all about. Primary campaigns, general elections, emphasis on change. Policy is always more of a mix. Does it mean an administration was not truthful to its campaign? Of course not. Sometimes administrations come in and they do change for change's sake. I think, in my view, you go back to 2001, and some of the policies the Bush administration changed right at the beginning were perfectly within its rights to change. It had different views of different aspects. But there are a number of people at the time, myself included, that in a couple areas like the Middle East peace process and the Koreas, it sort of changed because it wanted to have the UNCOLA. You know, it did. The policies actually had some legs still, but it changed it for change's sake. I'm not sure that really serves very positive purposes. So, you know, there's not a full break here with the Bush administration. There are elements of continuity that get emphasized more in policy than in campaigns, and I think that's to its credit, not a negative. But I think it's pretty clear what the differences are between an Obama foreign policy and a Bush foreign policy. And some people have raised this issue. We can address it. But I think that this one tries to strike and does a good job of striking a balance between change and continuity. So in terms of the strengths, let me make 5 sort of general points. Again, briefly, not developing them fully, but sort of laying them out. First is I think this largely gets right the 21st century strategic context. And I say that in 2 very central respects. One is its understanding of the nature of power in the 21st century. There are plenty of aspects here that affirm American power and position, that we remain the most powerful state by most measures in the international system. But it avoids what I sort of see as the old fallacy going back to the ancient Greeks and Thucydides, who said, you know, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. I actually think that was probably more than anything else the most fundamental lesson of the Bush foreign policy, that the strong couldn't always do what they wanted to do, or at least do it successfully, and the weak weren't always going to roll over and get out of the way. And if you sort of take that notion, everybody likes to cite Thucydides. You sound like you're doing grand strategy, right? But it's fundamentally a fallacy about the nature of power in the 21st century. And moreover, there are forces at work even during the Bush administration that were underlying and really weren't the fault of the Bush administration, that were contributing to the diffusion of power in the international system. There are deep and broad forces of historic transition going on since the end of the Cold War. There were rates of economic growth and development going on in what we call in this strategy the emerging powers of influence. There was the diplomatic emergence. I mean, just as one example, I was down in Brazil late April now, and had a number of discussions there. And one of the things they're proud of is in the last few years they've opened up 35 to 40 new embassies around the world, and that they had increased the size of their entering class in their diplomatic academy by some very substantial percentage. You know, there are forces going on in the world that have contributed to the diffusion of power, which still leaves the United States in a strong position, but you have to understand the ways in which both the scope and the limits of American power. And I think this strategy has a good sense of that. You can see some of that in the verbs that it uses. It talks about enhancing and promoting. And so you see a sense of how it understands that American power and position is a crucial part of many of these objectives we have. But there are very few in which it's within our power to singularly make sure that they get accomplished. The second part of the strategic context, I think it gets right, is the structure of the system. Now here let me divert and confess that a number of years ago as an undergraduate at Cornell, when there was a relatively unknown astronomy professor by the name of Carl Sagan who used to teach a course of astronomy for non-majors. So I've sort of loved, you know, astronomy metaphor since then. And I think here we want to go back to the ancient Greek Ptolemy, who had a view of the world, right, that the Earth was at the center and everything else revolved around the Earth. One could argue that's how we saw, and to an extent that's how the world was during the Cold War. American power, the American engine is the driver of the global economy, American ideals and the like. But you know, a number of centuries later along came Copernicus and said, actually that's not the way it is. We all have our own orbit. There's something called the sun at the middle, and the Earth is one among many that has orbits. And I think the world, the 21st century world, is much more of a Copernican world than a Ptolemaic world. There are a number of countries that have their own identity, their own interests. There's a real question about what is that force, and we'll talk some about this in the middle, like the sun trying to hold us together. That's one of the great challenges we all face. But it's not a world that revolves around the United States, not culturally, not economically. People talk about globalization with an Asian face now, not just a Western face. And states have many states, not just the Brazils and the Turkeys and the Indonesias and the South Africas, but any number of states are discovering their own sense of identity and interest. And it's a very different structure. And the notion of multipolarity doesn't even capture it, as if 5 or 7 countries sit around the table and we all would control the world. And so I think this sense comes through about what the strategic context is. And frankly, for any strategy, if you don't get the context in which you're operating right, you're not going to have much chance at success. Secondly, and sort of following from this, is the U.S. role. And I sort of said this to a certain extent already, but the U.S. can't do most of the issues on our own, but there's lots that others can't do without us. There are some tendencies. It's not that we're a part of every mix, but when you look at the major issues, whether it's climate change or peace and security in the Middle East or terrorism or the international economy, the United States playing a constructive role is crucial in the eyes of most in the world. Now, they may differ over what that means. At the same time, I think it is not declinism and it's not lack of pride, but it's realistic. I don't want to get into the realism, idealism debate, to say that there are many of our objectives in our national interests that we cannot accomplish strictly on our own. And I think that comes through here also in the strategy. Third is, as it said in the strategy, we're at war. We have 2 wars, but wars do not fully define our threats, challenges, and opportunities. The language in the strategy is there are other elements of our strategic environment, and the wars cannot define America's engagement with the world. Again, I think that's realistic. We do have 2 wars going on, but I think that if those were the only priorities we had, it would not serve any of our national interests, either our economic interests, our security interests, and the like. So there is clearly a sense of we are still a country at war. But the complexity of the strategic environment, threats, challenges, and opportunities goes beyond those wars. Fourth is how it sort of deals with what we've often sort of called multilateralism. And I think we're finally moving away from the silly, simplistic unilateralism versus multilateralism debate. As it said in the strategy, we need to be clear-eyed, not starry-eyed about multilateralism. And it's also this sort of multifaceted approach. Okay? There's a certain amount of attention to architecture. The G20 was mentioned as a significant innovation. Didn't start this administration. The Bush administration did some work on it. Indeed, the Canadians were really the forerunners of this. But I think that there's some efforts to change the architecture to make sure that institutions can serve their purposes, that we need to think about results, not just process. In my view, I'm sure we'll talk about this, part of the Iran issue is very much about do we want to have strong international institutions in the proliferation area like the IAEA, which has been pretty firm in its statements about what Iranian violations are. And there are multiple configurations and multi-level. Secretary Clinton's been down at the OAS this week. Regional institutions are playing a much more important part of the world. You see this in Asia. You see it in Europe, notwithstanding the current issues over the euro. You see it in Africa. The African Union, while it has limits and flaws, is a more significant institution than the old OAU was. You see it in this hemisphere with UNASUR and the like. And so it's this multifaceted approach to what kinds of ways we're trying to cooperate with other states and build institutions. And also about partnerships. Secretary Clinton's speech last July, which was a fairly central speech of the Council on Foreign Relations, she talked about a multi-partner world. I'll come back to this in a second because I'm not sure we've figured out fully how to do partnerships. But this notion of partnerships is very important. And Secretary Clinton at an event at Brookings the day the strategy came out talked about strategic persistence and patience, which I actually don't think is in the strategy itself, but I think is a useful way of thinking about how you try to work with partners with whom you have some shared interests, but you have some divergent interests, and you have some differences even when you have shared interest over what the optimal strategies are. But I think it's a flexible approach. Indeed, I like to think of it as looking for policy innovation. We talk in this country a lot about technological innovation, what we have and what we don't have. I heard on CNN this morning the statement by one of the reporters who said that there's been more innovation in what to do about oil spills in the last 7 weeks than in the last 7 years. A very telling comment, which sort of says that you could have had it but I digress, although I confess to having family in Louisiana. So, but we need policy innovation. What are creative ways to make sure there are results? In fact, this is a little bit of a push, a little tough love, a push to the liberal internationalist community. It's not enough to say we need to work through international institutions. You know, where are the results? Which ones are we satisfied with? How do we make them work better? You know, you can't just say, well, you know, John Bolton wants to get rid of them all. Well, that's not, you know, that's not sufficient. And I think this is an effort to acknowledge, doesn't fully answer that, but it acknowledges. And then the fifth point I want to make in strengths is the domestic foundations. And Patrick referenced this as well. America's global role requires strong domestic foundations. The world we live in is a disorderly world. It's not purely Hobbesian, but it's going to be disorderly for any variety of reasons. Globalization means greater interconnectedness, and our capacities, call it global governance or whatever, to manage that there's a gap between those and the extent to which we've become interconnected. And it's a disorderly world, and it's a competitive world. You know, historically, we actually, you know, it's a little bit of a simplification, but for much of our history, you know, we really were able to stand apart from much of the world, using our oceans as insulation, active in our own hemisphere. And then for the second half of the 20th century, we largely stood atop it. We've never really faced a competitive world as we face today, economically, in terms of ideas, a whole variety of things. And to compete in that world, you need strong domestic foundations. It's a little bit like an Olympic athlete, and you're going to go out there, and what you need to do to compete is to be as effective as you can, because the other competitors are trying to do it too. And I think the emphasis on domestic foundations is not kind of going internal, not external, but it's acknowledging in a disorderly and competitive world, and given the problems we have at home, we need stronger domestic foundations. So what are some of the limitations? I would say there are four I'll point out that I think, so there's no Kennan's successor bumper sticker here, right? No simple. That's had its allure. Many of us have been chasing that golden chalice for a long time. In the Clinton administration, we tried enlargement. Of course, we went, you know, then we got cables back from one ambassador said, enlargement, you know, that sounds like something that happens to your spleen. And then another from Latin America that said, well, the only way it translates down here is imperialismo, and I don't think that's what you mean. Actually, if you ask George Kennan, you know, he would remind us, while he was still here for his 100 years, that he never meant containment as the fully defining aspect of American foreign policy. It was very much about Eurasia. And indeed, if you look at the history, I don't think containment served us particularly well in many parts of the world. So the notion that, oh, we had this great thing in the Cold War, why can't we have it now? A, is rose-colored history. And B, I think the world in some ways is even more complex. So there's no bumper sticker. I don't know, that is a limitation, particularly for communication aspects. But I think that a little bit of that, I think, is very misleading. Secondly is leadership. So if you do a word search, it's used 60 times. Okay. What is leadership in this world we've been describing? It's a tough question. What is it? How do you exercise it? I think some of Heather's points were along these lines as well. I don't think the strategy answers it. And I actually, myself, a lot of my own work, have thought about this and struggled with this a lot. What's the metaphor that's out there? What's the model? What's the analogy from the private sector, from history, from, you know, other things? It's very hard to find, you know, what that model is for this notion of America as, you know, as a very strong power. We had the notion of indispensable nation in the latter Clinton years and the like. But I think that there is a lot of reference, but I think it's hard to define what leadership is and how you exercise it. I don't think it's a simple definition. I think what the strategy does, consistent with Heather's notion of signaling, is affirm America's commitment to being a leader. But I think it's a fair point that we haven't fully thought through, you know, what that is and exactly how to do it. And it's something, whether it's in metaphorical terms or very specific terms, my own view is it's not something we're going to actually precisely define and follow everywhere, but it's going to come from different wrestlings and strugglings with how you work with different kinds of coalitions and solve different problems, going back to this notion that most problems in the world need us to play a constructive role, but we can't do them on our own. But I think that, that's a fair point, but it's easier to say it doesn't define leadership than to say, okay, how would you define it? And I'm very open to answers if people have good answers to that, but it's a limitation. Third is priorities. Again, there's been points of, well, what are your priorities? You have an awful lot. If you look at the table of contents, it's an awful lot of issues defined there. Here, too, part of the message is it's a comprehensive agenda, the nature of security and interest in the world today. And implicitly, I think there is a little bit of memory going back to Dean Acheson in 1950, in which fairly or unfairly, when it defined the perimeter of American interests and did not explicitly say Korea, many at the time and many historians believed that that was one of the factors that led to the North Korean invasion of South Korea and the Korean War. And it wasn't the sense that we didn't care about it, but you were trying to define your interests in a more finite way. So there's pros and cons to having said these are our 5 priorities, not our 15 or 20. Moreover, priorities are not just a function of intrinsic interest, but of threats and opportunities. 6 months ago, if we were asked, how high should Korea be as a priority, I said, well, there's this proliferation problem, and I guess, well, now, there's a risk of war in the peninsula. So part of your prioritization is not just what your intrinsic interests are, but how threats and opportunities play on those. So again, it's a limitation. But I think that there's pros and cons to having a rank ordering or a finite list. And fourth and last is this notion of cooperation in a Copernican world. If you word search, the mutual or the versions of mutuality is used somewhere between 25 and 30 times. And I think it's a fair point to say that we believe that the solution to many of these problems really requires states to see where they have mutual interests. But I think that's not where we are. States differ. The debate over Iran sanctions with countries like Brazil and Turkey is not as simple as them being anti-American. There are fundamental differences over sanctions as an effective tool, prioritization of this issue on others. How do we activate these partnerships? The how question of strategy, basically. Not so much a multi-bulleted plan, that's for memos, but how you achieve cooperation, how you achieve this mutuality and partnerships is not fleshed out in the strategy. It's affirmed that that's what we want. Again, hard to do. I think any fleshing out could still be debated, but it's a fair point to say that those are limitations. So in sum, I think it accomplishes a great deal. It is not only a framework, but a working framework for administration in which much of the things get fleshed out as one goes along. I think it accomplishes the goals of giving us this, cohesive framework about the nature of the world. And some of these limitations, I think, I don't necessarily see as major problems or weaknesses. Others may. But they're parts, I think, that speak to the limits of a national security strategy. And some of the work that remains to be done as you proceed into the actual policies that are based on what you've done so far, and as well as what you've laid out in the national security strategy. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Bruce. That was great. We're going to turn to Jim Locher, actually, first, Mike, and then we'll come to you. What we're going to do is Jim and Mike will both speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a little bit of back and forth on the panel, and we'll open up to Q&A right after. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about the organizational dimension of the national security strategy, or what Patrick called the architecture. From the perspective of the Project on National Security Reform, this is a good news story, at least in terms of rhetoric. The strategy endorses many ideas that the Project on National Security Reform has been promoting for several years. The strategy implicitly calls for a bold transformation of the national security system. In organizational terms, it aspires to first strengthen national capacity through a whole-of-government approach. Second, update, balance, and integrate all tools of American power. Third, broaden the scope of national security. Fourth, emphasize the foundations of national power, sound fiscal policy, education, energy, science and technology, and health. Fifth, align resources with strategy, something that we do not do at present. Six, take a longer view. Our government, as you know, has a very near-term focus. And last, form strategic partnerships with organizations outside of government, essentially taking a whole-of-nation approach. Now, when Heather was speaking, she made me think of another point that I needed to make at this point in time. And she was talking about the strategy talking to the national security professionals. And it does in that regard. And it lays out principles for how the national security system should operate. At the beginning of the Obama administration, the Project on National Security Reform sent to the White House some principles that we thought ought to be placed out there. We currently don't have a set of principles, and I think this national security strategy plays an important role in terms of describing, in organizational terms, how the national security system should operate. The strategy actually lists 23 institutional reforms, and let me just give you a couple of examples. Adapting the education and training of national security professionals to equip them to meet modern challenges. The second one, achieve integration of our efforts to implement and monitor operations, policies, and strategies. Just from these two examples and the other 21, you can get a sense that there is going to be some very heavy lifting involved to achieve these organizational goals. Now, from my perspective, national security reform deserves the attention that it is given in the strategy. From the study that we've done in the Project on National Security Reform, many of our mission areas, if not all of them, from Afghanistan to combating terrorism to cybersecurity, have either been undermined, if not crippled, by our organizational dysfunction. The fundamental problem that we face is that our organizational arrangements are misaligned with 21st century security challenges. We are dominated, our government is dominated by rigid, bureaucratic, competitive, vertically oriented departments and agencies. We need a very different organizational model, one capable of tightly and effectively integrating the capacities and expertise of the departments and agencies. Essentially, what we confront are horizontal problems that require that we work across the departments and agencies. So we have horizontal problems and we have an incredibly vertical government. Secretary Gates has called for major national security reform, including a new National Security Act, in 3 bold speeches, the most recent one this past February. And in that speech, the Secretary described the situation, and I quote, "America's interagency toolkit is a hodgepodge of jerry-rigged arrangements constrained by a dated and complex patchwork of authorities, persistent shortfalls in resources, and unwieldy process." He noted, for the most part, America's instruments of national power, military and civilian, were set up in a different era for a very different set of threats. He saw the need to adapt and reform our 63-year-old apparatus will be the institutional challenge of our time. And he sees major change being required, saying that new institutions are needed for the 21st century, new organizations with a 21st century mindset. Now, there's been lots of evidence in recent years that our system is not working. The 9/11 terrorist attacks, the troubled stability operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the poor response to Hurricane Katrina, the near misses on Christmas Day and in Times Square. These setbacks and near misses are not coincidental. They are evidence of systemic failure. And systemic failure calls for systemic reform, not the piecemeal, ambiguous reforms of recent years. And the Obama National Security Strategy calls for systemic reform. There is a 3-page text box that underscores the administration's commitment. There are only 2 text boxes that are highlighted, and one of those is completely devoted to this idea of national security reform. But we have heard similar commitments before. Let me just read one sentence out of the 2006 National Security Strategy. It declared, and I quote, "The United States must transform America's national security institutions to meet the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century." Little occurred to fix any of the fundamental problems. Now, the National Security Strategy notes that achieving these reforms will be quite difficult. In general, David Barno quoted in this regard, he said, "The new strategy's core challenge will be in marshaling the will to effect the requisite changes in government bureaucracy, both in Congress and the executive, implicitly needed to deliver on its promise." The administration must understand the impediments to needed reforms. And in the project on national security reform over the last 3 years, we've gotten a pretty good sense of the obstacles that are out there. The first one is an intellectual obstacle. We still have the core Cold War mental model. And lots of the new modern organizational practice that is out there, especially in business, is very alien to government thinking. There are the political impediments, the entrenched interests, both on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch, like things the way they are and fear what change will bring. The transformation of the national security system will be the largest transformation ever attempted, and so its unprecedented size and scope causes some people not to get committed. Ownership. In the large system, there are only 3 owners: the president, the vice president, and General Jones. There's no owner on Capitol Hill, because they are in their narrow committee jurisdictions. And once you leave the executive office of the president, there is not a commitment in the departments and agencies to doing system-wide reform. And the last problem, and maybe the most serious one, is bandwidth. Our system is so dysfunctional that it takes the energy of people working incredibly hard, working 14-hour days, day after day, just to do the work of today and tomorrow. There is no capacity to do institutional reform. To overcome these impediments, the president must prepare and execute an implementation roadmap. Yesterday, in testimony, I recommended that Congress require the president to submit such a roadmap. In it, the president should identify the specific reforms that need to be taken and to achieve his organizational goals and milestones for their achievement. Each year, Congress should ask for a scorecard measuring progress towards these reforms and an updated implementation plan. National security reform of this magnitude is a daunting but also absolutely necessary if the administration expects anyone to take its national security strategy seriously. After all, no strategy is worthwhile if it cannot be executed. Thank you.
Well, there's been a lot of criticism of this national security strategy for not being a national security strategy. As the first 2 speakers pointed out, one suggested it's a signaling device. The other, it's a framework. I think that's fine, actually. I'm very skeptical about a particular Central European idea of strategy as something that the great professor genius, Bismarck, Metternich, Kissinger comes up with in his office, and then you have a totally centralized autocratic system, and then everyone just carries this out. And as my friend Walter Russell Mead pointed out one time, it's kind of ironic that first Prussia and then Germany, Imperial Germany and then Nazi Germany, had that model where you have this grand strategy with the great genius at the center, and then the obedient bureaucracy. And and of course we were criticized, the Anglo-Americans, for the decentralized system and the kind of amateurishness. Well, who did better in the 20th century? And then after the Germans committed suicide twice, we then imported a lot of their professors in order to instruct us in the arcane art of successful Central European strategy. So if this is not a grand strategy in that sense, that's not bad at all. We've heard a signaling device framework. I would say consensus, maybe. The Italian journalist Luigi Barzini one time wrote that the British Empire worked, even though it had no bureaucracy, this vast, far-flung global empire in the 19th century, because, and even though the British officers weren't terribly intelligent, because all British officers everywhere in the world only had 7 ideas. That was all their mind could hold. But it was the same 7 ideas. So Queen Victoria and Lord Salisbury could be confident that their man in Burma would do what they would do on the spot, and even though they didn't have the advanced communications. So I do think a consensus and having a few ideas that's in the mind of everyone, may be a useful alternative to this very centralized system. I was in Paris a few years ago. I asked some French officials what the partisan differences were on foreign policy, just speaking of consensus. And they looked at me as though I were completely ignorant. And they said, we have no partisan disagreements in foreign policy in France. Socialists, conservatives, it's what's in the interest of France. In this country, for better or worse, we do have partisan differences. And I think they're illustrated by a comparison of this document, not only with the exercises of the Bush administration, but on my way over here, I was thinking, what would a McCain national security strategy look like? And I think it'd be considerably different in many of the same respects. If you've read any of the criticism on the part of neoconservatives of this document, they've attacked it for what I think are actually its strengths. They've said, the document goes to great length to say that Al-Qaeda is a network of terrorists and criminals, that we're not at war with Islam, that this is not a great global ideological crusade like the Cold War supposedly was. Well, the document's right in that sense. I think that really pushes the consensus in the right direction. We came to disaster almost under the Bush years by this attempt to view jihadism as though somehow it were the equivalent of fascism or of communism. And this was a great global struggle. It was like Norman Podhoretz called it World War IV. So this document is much saner and more sensible than that. The other criticism from aspects, some of the groups on the right has been that this is too multilateral. That is, we're being tied down by this commitment to multilateral institutions. And again, I think on that point, this document pushes the consensus in the right direction. It actually says from within the government what people outside the government have been saying since 1989, which is instead of simply patching up the post-1945 system of institutions, we need to come up with new institutions, and we have to bring in new powers other than our old European and East Asian allies. So I think that's a strength, not a weakness. And finally, one conservative commentator was criticizing the emphasis on the economy in this document. Not that they're necessarily the best people, have the best standing to criticize that. I do have some criticisms of the economic aspect of the document, which I'll get to in a minute. But I think that the era in which you could separate political economy from national security, that was a very strange, it was a brief era. It was really early in the Cold War. It was up until the 1970s, and arguably we had a lot of problems because Nixon and Kissinger started to think their way through this, that we have economic competition and military competition, and the actors don't totally overlap. But the idea that you can just take the economy for granted and then foreign policy is about bombs and missiles and counterinsurgency, that arguably was irrelevant 50 years ago. It's certainly been irrelevant for the last decade or two. So in all of these respects, I think that this document, if it's trying to define a consensus instead of divulging our secret plan to team up with Salvador to encircle Honduras, which, if we have one, it should not be published, that kind of strategy. But if you're having a public document that defines a worldview, you know, I think this is a great improvement over its predecessor. Now, what are my criticisms? Well, I have two criticisms, essentially, and I think that the document buys into the conventional wisdom in two areas where it's kind of disappointing because it pushes the debate in other areas. You know, first, there's this statement: this administration has no greater responsibility than the safety and security of the American people. And there is no greater threat to the American people than weapons of mass destruction, particularly the danger posed by the pursuit of nuclear weapons by violent extremists and their proliferation to additional states. Now, we have heard this not just since 9/11, but, you know, for 20 or 30 years. And I think there are two fallacies here, and the time has come. If we're going to attack orthodoxy, this orthodoxy needs to be attacked. The first fallacy is that the countries that are seeking nuclear weapons are doing so in order to attack Americans in the United States. I don't think any serious regional scholar of Asia or the Middle East believes this. Iran was attacked with the support of the United States by Iraq, and 1 million Iranians died. It is surrounded by US forces. It has seen the US invade countries on its borders. If you were an Iranian, you know, what would your motive be, right? You know, it's defensive. It's clearly defensive. The North Korean regime, they're not going to try to blow up Washington. I live a few blocks away from the White House. And unless, you know, other people on the panel know something I don't know, I sleep soundly at night, having calculated the possibility that the North Koreans will incinerate me without warning. The North Korean regime is a decrepit, bankrupt gangster state which is using nuclear weapons to extort money from the rest of the world. They have, if there's any evidence that they intend to attack the United States or to give it to terrorists, you know, I'm unaware of this. So let's make it clear that we have contributed to this nuclear proliferation problem by our policy of regime destruction, which began with Noriega, which continued with Milosevic, which continued with the Iraq War. For most of American history, we did not fight our wars to destroy the enemy regime. Let me repeat that, because we're talking about strategy. In most of American history, our goal in war was to defeat the other country while leaving its government intact. Now, World War II was an exception, where we wanted to engage in debellation, as the legal term is, of Germany and of Japan. That was the exception. Was not the rule. In the Korean War and the Vietnam War, we did not fight to destroy the regime and occupy the country and create a new regime. Beginning with Noriega, well, actually beginning with Grenada, we treated every enemy as though it were Nazi Germany, and the regime had to be completely overthrown and a completely new regime built up from the bottom. Now, in the Iraq War, it was the evident hope of the U.S. that Saddam would be killed or overthrown. You know, he survived. But then in the Gulf War, you know, I'm in the Iraq War, in the Gulf War, he survived against our wishes. And then in the Iraq War, you know, we carried out this debellation. Or Afghanistan, war of debellation, right? So it's because of this policy of saying that, you know, the enemy regime says, well, what do you want from us? And we're like that alien in Independence Day, and we say, we want you to die. And in fact, we try to murder the leaders, which is something that goes against traditional American diplomacy. When we begin wars like the Gulf War with an attempt to assassinate the foreign head of state with bombing, okay, because they're Hitler. Everybody's Hitler. So of course these regimes are going to try to get weapons of mass destruction. They're bankrupt. They're broke. What are they supposed to do? Have world-class navies and air forces that can defeat the U.S.? So, you know, just to finish up this point, I think what we're doing is we're encircling these countries. We're saying that essentially you have to resign and go on trial as a war criminal, right, or be killed by our bombs. So there's no negotiation there, right? And so then when they try to get what poor countries do, because weapons of mass destruction, whether they're chemical or nuclear, that's the poor man's defensive weapon. It's not an offensive weapon. We're the only country that's ever used it offensively. It's a defensive weapon. That's why Israel has nuclear weapons. It's defensive. It's not aggressive. Makes perfect sense. So then we say they get these defensive weapons because they're terrified that we're going to overthrow them and possibly murder their leadership. And then we say, oh, look, they're going to attack Alaska, the North Koreans. It could reach Alaska, right? You may remember during the Gulf War, there were these people saying, oh, he's got these little, sort of drones that can hit Kansas, right? Saddam Hussein. That's not why, they're trying to get weapons of mass destruction. So I think this is a fraud on the public. And if I'm passionate about this, it's because this administration, which has gone against nonsense in many other areas, is repeating what I think is pernicious nonsense. And what's even more pernicious is the pursuit of nuclear weapons by violent extremists. And again, I'm maybe in the minority here. I've heard about this for 30 years, right? It was because terrorists could not get nuclear weapons that they resorted to airplanes until that became too difficult. You can only do it once, really, successfully. They've came close a couple of other times. So then, they're reduced to sniping, to blowing up buses, blowing up trains. So I think that this is one area where both parties, liberals and conservatives, are not being honest about the real threat of nuclear proliferation. And if you talk to foreign policymakers and thinkers, what's the real problem with nuclear proliferation? They say, well, it will lead to regional arms races, right? So that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, are they going to give it to Al-Qaeda to blow me up on 16th Street in Washington? No, nobody believes this. Nobody, right? Are they going to blow up Israel? Yeah, right. They're going to kill half the Palestinian population in the name of the Palestinian population. Of course not. Of course not. Well, then what's the concern? The concern is that Saudi Arabia and Egypt and these other countries will then have regional arms races. And then you'll have this kind of pre-World War I type situation. And same in East Asia. Japan will go nuclear and so on. Well, as a citizen of the United States, if foreign policy thinkers are going to talk about this, in private, I think that, we should discuss this in public. Just one more point to wrap up. The discussion of economics is entirely in the area of foundations of national power. That is, we have to have a strong economy in order to have military and diplomatic influence. That's true as far as it goes, and I think this is a great advance over the Bush administration, which just ignored the economic dimension. It sounds very 1990s. I mean, the stuff on economics in this sounds like it could have been written in the Clinton years, when there was all this optimism about free trade and globalization, and we're moving inexorably, towards this rule-governed global economy, and the Chinese will eventually liberalize their economy. And also that the American model of liberal capitalism fundamentally works. Well, I think you have to change your views after 2008, by the time you get to 2009. We have seen the collapse of the American shareholder model of capitalism. No one wants to copy this now. I mean, there will be capitalism. I mean, there's not an alternative. But the American model is discredited around the world of this stock market-driven capitalism. When it comes to economic power, I don't think that in 2010 you can think of the economy simply as the basis for your military and diplomatic power. You have to think of it as the arena for great power competition. The great question that is left out of this report is when 3 of the 4 largest industrial capitalist countries in the world, China, Japan, and Germany, want to run perpetual trade surpluses and they rig the trading system and their own domestic systems for classic 17th, 18th century mercantilist policies, then how can you be talking, in this kind of happy talk from the 1990s about everyone has, we all believe in markets, and we're all moving towards one great big rule-governed global system. So those are two big exceptions I have to my general praise for this. But again, compared to the McCain national security strategy we might have had, this is a great improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jim. Everyone, I think I want to take the host prerogative to ask the panel a question and direct it, I think, first at Bruce. And I think it gets to this question about the role of national security strategy and the question of some of the really large strategic issues that I raised, that Mike raised, and that the national security strategy doesn't seem to be the vehicle, as Heather was saying, for that conversation. It's really much more about signaling what our intention is. It's a political document in a midterm election year. There's a lot of different, you need to capture the bureaucracy, you need to kind of align forces. But there's some really big fundamental questions about the nature of the international order here that need to be discussed. What's, from what from where you sit, either as a professor of political science or as a part-time consultant, how do you see this administration handling those big questions? And if we're looking at where an answer may come, did we find it? Is the national security strategy actually where the Obama administration is thinking, or is it a conversation that's ongoing and we're going to see it evolve over time, come out in different formats, in different vehicles? The Truman administration didn't have a national security strategy. It had a secret document called NSC 68. The Eisenhower administration had the Solarium Project, which was also secret. What are the other processes for continuing the conversation about national security strategy now that we've got this one out?
Is working. Well, I think that what I tried to lay out was this notion of a framework to be fleshed out, and I think the points were that the framework that responds to the questions you're raising, I think, is there in terms of how we see the strategic context. This notion of the scope and limits of American power, sort of a multifaceted approach to various forms of cooperation. I think Michael was raising two particular points and Jim was raising one organizationally. But there is no, I think we overdo the past as if there was some, sense, again, by the notion of Kennan, was a very particular approach to a very particular problem. So let me give you some examples where it git fleshed out. And I think the test would be if you look back at this document in a couple of years, because it is a strategic document. I think Heather was saying that it has some political constraints about what you can say and what you can't say, what language you use, but that it's a strategic document in a political context, not that it's a political document. So the G20, for example, okay? Well, that was served right up to you by the nature of the financial crisis when you took office. And the G20 functioned pretty well, I think, in avoiding going further into the global abyss that could well have happened. There are all sorts of theories. I'm actually headed to Toronto later today for some discussions on this about what the G20 should be. There are some that see it as the new great group. I actually don't believe that. I think that one of the failures of the G7, G8 was not just that it needed to be more representative, include more of the global GDP, but that it kept getting diverted from its mission. It was indeed created in the mid-'70s to deal with the energy crisis and financial, and every time it would meet to deal with economic problems, it would be distracted by one event or another. So I think we're going to see many different aspects. I think if you look at the issues that have been raised on the Iranian nuclear proliferation issue, in a number of aspects. I think some of the points Michael's raising. But I also think how you deal with many actors, right? We had this process called the P5+1. Well, hey, we had the P5 Security Council members and Germany. And then other countries say we actually want to be a part of the process too. I think Secretary Clinton's statements yesterday after the passage of the U.S. Security Council resolution was saying a couple things. One is sanctions is a part of a strategy. It's not a whole strategy. I think some people straw man it differently. Secondly is we haven't stopped discussions with the Brazilians and the Turks. I'm not sure we've handled that exactly right up to this point. But what emerges from that will be this notion of what a multi-partner diplomacy look like. How we deal with the relationship with Russia, where we do have, in the notion of the reset, there are a lot of issues, I think, in which we, I think, frankly, have shifted our priorities in a better way. We're working together, but it doesn't mean we're working together on everything. The China issue, I think, has shown us sort of some of the limits of that. So there's not going to be a single answer to that, nor, moreover, is it only going to come from the United States. I think it's going to come from the actions of others. I mean, in fact, Steve Clemens and I were in Doha, Qatar last week for a series of meetings. One of the interesting things there is, look who's an actor in Darfur diplomacy now. The Qataris. Look who was trying to do something about the Lebanon issues a couple years ago, the Qataris. Little country. And it's not so much that we absolutely agree with what they are, but there are many actors out there. So this notion of what global governance looks like is not going to be sort of some grand design. I think the top-down strategy, some of my friends and colleagues who work for McKinsey remind me that some of the best strategic planning in corporations happens from a mix of top-down guidance and bottom-up creativity and ideas. And so it's going to be messy. Copenhagen showed the messiness of multilateralism in a non-productive way, which again is a lesson for all those who just think multilateralism is the answer. But it's not going to be perfect. It's not all going to be architecture. Some of it is going to be sort of the inductive process of what works in different ways.
Okay, thanks. Heather.
So I'm really struck by Michael's initial point about the sort of what were the 7 things that every British colonial officer knew.
I don't know what they were in particular.
No, no, but I think the point here is that the 5 things that Bruce rattled off as the strengths of this strategy are a pretty good stand-in for the 5 things that this administration wants everybody who's making and implementing U.S. foreign policy around the world to know and agree. And I think they happen to be, at that level, 5 things that everyone on the panel also agrees with without getting to the particular critiques and implementations that people raise. So then, Patrick, to your question, the question becomes, how is the administration doing, and how are people outside the administration who share those 5 points doing at moving them through the bureaucracy, through industry, through everybody in the United States whose job it is to interface with the rest of the world? And then how are we doing at using all of those contexts to promote the kind of bottom-up as well as top-down debates that Bruce was talking about in terms of figuring out, well, how do you actually make multilateralism work? And there, I think that's where I would have my real criticism of where maybe it's not that this is being done badly, but that it isn't being done enough. That if you assume that you've got a relatively short window to really impose this framework, and not just to impose it, but start really provoking creativity and debate around the implementation of it, you can see a lot more that could be done using the very powerful microphones and bully pulpits that the administration has to hand. Where you get into implementation, and I think some of the critiques that were raised could and should be being fought out all the time, but there's not necessarily always the willingness to put the political oomph into doing that. And so that's where I see the gap opening up and not being filled, to have an effective sort of version of the Anglo-American model where we're all amateur grand strategists in our own way.
Great, thanks. Jim, did I see you want to?
Michael opened up an interesting area by talking about the British officers. Because in our system, and in all organizations, the most important element of organizational effectiveness is something known as shared values. And that's what these British officers had. And in our interagency system, we don't have shared values. And shared values is an agreed vision, an agreement as to our missions, an agreement to a set of principles under which we are going to operate. And when we come together at the interagency table, we do not have shared values. And they can be hugely powerful. And they can offset the lack of structure and process and lots of other things. And this is something that is missing in our system. I think this strategy helps because it starts to provide some of the principles, but there is lots of work to be done in this particular area.
Great. Okay, I think what we'll do is turn it over to you so we can get some questions in. I think we've got a microphone in the back. Bill, why don't you start us off?
Yes, Bill Hart, New America Foundation. In terms of the economic engine, there's a phrase in the report, we need to grow our economy and reduce our deficit. I have some questions whether we want to reduce the deficit in the middle of a recession, but more broadly, any of the panelists who would want to comment on how do we restart the economic engine as a foundation for our security policy?
Well, our strategy all the way up until the end of the Cold War, which only a few of us historians know about, was that we were going to, in the event of a protracted conventional struggle with another great power, the Soviet Union or China, we would mobilize our domestic manufacturing base. That is, it was always assumed all throughout the Cold War that we only had enough forces in being to hold off the Warsaw Pact for a couple of months. And during that time, assuming we used our nuclear umbrella to deter nuclear warfare, we would have a World War II type mobilization. And there was an officer who had the phone numbers of every CEO of the steel companies and the automobile companies and all of that. So we had this debate about industrial policy in the 1980s and 90s. And the proponents, the people who said, well, you can't be a great military power unless you're one of the world's dominant manufacturing powers. That means manufacturing all sorts of things, not just a few boutique things. They lost. They lost. It was rejected by the Clinton administration. It was rejected by the Bush administration. The first Bush administration, one of their officers famously said, it doesn't matter whether we make computer chips or potato chips. This is still off the table, right? Because to mention that manufacturing is the basis of American military strength, not finance, not forces in being that you buy with tax revenues, but the ability to mobilize your industrial power in a rivalry with a peer competitor, not some broken down Neolithic country with a few criminals hiding in caves, but with a real industrial rival. This is still taboo in Washington. Some of us promote this, but I think this is going to have to come back, because and that was my point about China. If you look at George W. Bush's 2002 speech at West Point, he says, well, we will continue to be the dominant military power, and other countries should specialize in trade and the pursuits of peace. So in other words, you guys make the cars, and we'll have the tanks and we'll police the world. Well, if you lose your car making ability, you lose your tank making ability. If you don't make ships anymore, you can't just buy the ships in an emergency. So I think, that's my answer. And to the deficit, I would much rather have a larger deficit and a bigger manufacturing base than a balanced budget and an economy based on real estate and services.
Yeah, Patrick mentioned that this book I wrote with my colleague Steve Weber that'll be out actually a couple of months from Harvard Press. But prior to that, we did an article, cover story for your neighbor's Foreign Policy magazine back in November '08, and on sort of the same things. And one of the things we sort of said was, the 20th century, one of the great debates was capitalism versus socialism, and capitalism won. I think one of the really interesting questions we face now is sort of this whole relationship between the state and market. So it's true that China and India have done better because they've become more capitalist. It's also true that they've maintained a significant role for the state in their economies, right? And I think that one of the challenges is how to do it in a way that's not, mercantilistic in the classical ways. But I think that one of the challenges that we face is in terms of our own economy. It seems to me that from a domestic foundations of America's global role, we have to do a couple of things. One was we have to reduce our vulnerabilities, as in energy and environment. I'm not an advocate. I never use the term energy independence because there's no such thing, but I do use the term reducing your energy vulnerability. I don't see how we do that as well as deal with environmental issues without finding the right kind of relationship between the state and the market. The market has its externalities. Well, that was the point I made about that quote on CNN this morning. More innovation on dealing with oil spills in 7 weeks than 7 years. So that tells you that it hasn't been technologically impossible. It says that the incentives weren't there. And the only way to deal with externalities is to find a way, I think, to get the best out of the markets and the best out of government's role, to reduce vulnerabilities, to pursue innovation, most of which does come from the private sector. But I think that there's a balance point in those relationships. And also, I think, to create resilience. I mean, things are going to happen, and you try to reduce the probability of them. And so the economic challenges we face, to me, are more than just sort of the list of things. But finally, it really does come down to the notion, I think, of if we understand that jobs for the average person out there are not just about their income, but about their identity, then we really have to take seriously whether it's manufacturing or other aspects that give people this sense, because when they lose that, it feeds all sorts of other fears that can be damaging to us both at home and abroad. So, I mean, I really think the challenges we face, and again, in the context I said before, this being a more competitive world than we've ever faced before, are really formidable, and we really have to take them as that, not just as some cyclical aspect that we're going to sort of, work our way up the curve and get out of.
Great, thanks. Right here, Louise.
Hi, Louise Diamond, Global Systems Initiative. So I really appreciate this panel, and I appreciate the view that when you have a system in dysfunction, you have to apply some systemic solutions. So one of the things we know about sustainable systems is that it needs to, the solutions need to thread through three levels: through the political level, which you've talked about, through the institutional level, which you've talked about, also through the social level, which you haven't talked much about. That you can call that the bottom up, you can call that getting the, listening to the American people, to the NGOs, to the civil society, however you want to frame that. But where is that in this conversation? And how is that being implemented? The other part of that is that I think it was Jim who identified one of the key obstacles is the intellectual. And as I listen to all of you, I think that falls into four areas. There's the way we think, the mind, the worldview, how we see the world, and how many of us still see the world from 50 years ago. And how does that get changed? But also, what do we know about leadership? You identified leadership as a key component. You identified change, systems change and transformation as a key component. And you identified partnership as a key component. And we know that there's expertise on those issues outside of government. So how are we using that?
Heather first, and then Jim.
So on that question, I think in 2008, there was a very interesting sort of opening up of a public dialogue on national security issues. And there was a real, and you saw both parties responding to it in the political context. And you saw a real attempt to consider, and you could look at this really unsettled polling data, broad interest in having discussions about national security issues across the country outside the Beltway, that there was really some reconsideration going on at the public level, and that got noticed at the political level, I would say. And it had a lot to do with the way both campaigns talked a lot about renewing respect for America, changing the way the U.S. was portrayed globally and the way we portrayed ourselves globally. In the last year and a half, I would say both because of the perception that Americans care more about domestic, immediate pocketbook issues, and that the kind of linkages that Bill, Mike, and Bruce were just making in response to the last question are too complicated for people to understand. And because, frankly, there's been a very deliberate effort by the neocons to shut down the kind of public discourse that was going on and to drive it back to a kind of public discourse based on fear and sort of monkey brain responses to the way you need to think about the rest of the world outside is that it's an existential threat to you, so that the quality and quantity of that discourse has really been driven backwards, just at the moment that I think it instead needed to be driven forward, because any administration naturally becomes more and more inward-looking as time goes on. And I think the overall import of your questions is, why isn't there more of a dialogue with civil society about all of these issues? And any administration turns more and more in on itself. And I think at a moment where it would have been more helpful to have a lot more public discussion, debate, pressure welling up on these issues, that I think if you had somebody from White House Office of Public Liaison here, they would look politely at you and say, yeah, we don't ever hear anything about these issues.
Jim.
A great question, and let me try to respond to a few of these. With respect to the institutional changes that the strategy calls for, it's absolutely clear that a tremendous amount of outside expertise will be required. There are lots of people who are coming to the conclusion that the national security system is so broken that it cannot fix itself, that it is going to take lots of private assistance and pressure and influence to make it happen. And the document talks about strategic partnerships with outside organizations, but we've heard some of this before, and it hasn't happened. In the area in which I'm focused on, it will have to happen. We're trying to form that grand coalition of organizations to provide that assistance. The second thing about leadership, leadership in today's world is very different than the leadership we knew in the past. And there's lots of thought about the next generation of national security leaders. What do they need to be capable of doing in a world that is incredibly complex and with lots of uncertainty? There is some work being done on this inside government. The U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command has a major effort, but also up at Harvard. The last point about partnerships. Our federal government is not very inclusive. You know, we are still having trouble dealing with state, local, tribal, territorial, non-governmental, on homeland security kinds of issues. And there is a tremendous amount of expertise out there and people who need to be brought on board, and we'll have to work at that very, very hard.
I think I'm going to take one more question from the floor, and then we're going to have to close it down. Paul in the back.
Thanks, Patrick. This goes to what Heather commented on. And Michael, you'll find this amusing. The Army, U.S. Army, imported some things from the German Army in the 70s. And one of them was the commander's intent. And I had a conversation yesterday with Bob Polk from IDA. And forgive me, Bob, if I'm going to comment on what you said. But we were talking about this document. And he said that it seems more like a commander's intent. And it's the boss telling the organization, this is where I'd like it to go. And Heather's comment on the implementation phase, forgive the soldier in me, but we're kind of looking for an operations order or a campaign plan that will implement, will take the commander's intent and drive it home through the organization. And Jim, could you comment on that?
Absolutely. You know, maybe I ought to limit myself to the area of my focus. If there is not an implementation plan from the president for these institutional changes, nothing is going to happen. And I think that the Congress is going to have to play a role here in demanding that the president produce an implementation plan. We have an archaic set of institutions built in 1947 with just slight modifications since that time. They're completely outmoded for the kinds of complex challenges, rapidly paced challenges. And in the business world, which is dealing with the same sort of complexity and speed of change, they have built new organizations which are very effective. But Paul's absolutely correct. There needs to be an implementation plan that lays out how these changes are going to take place. It'll take 10 years or more for them to occur, so it's important to get the sequencing of actions absolutely right.
Great, thanks. I think with that, we're going to shut it down and respect everyone's schedules for the day. Thanks for getting an early start. And I want to thank Bruce and everyone on the panel for joining us today. This is going to be a conversation that we're going to have, as everyone knows. Once you get a strategy out, it hits the real world and things start to change. And we're going to be talking about strategy for quite some time to come. Thanks again, and we'll see you here at New America in the future.
That's a great line. Outside and then on Paul.